Welcome back to Queen City Corals. Today we're going to be talking about the most important aspect of any reef tank and the most annoying aspect of any reef tank, and that is testing. Starting off with testing, we're going to start off where every hobbyist starts off, and that is most likely with an API test kit. Now, these are the most basic and most affordable test kits on the market for the most part, and is a lot of times what most stores will use when they're testing for you. I recommend this being the lowest model that you go with. Below this is going to be things like testing strips, which are going to be pretty inaccurate, especially when it comes to saltwater. And it's almost better just to look at your tank and see how things are doing than use some of those test strips, especially if they're on the cheaper end. So I usually recommend starting off with some of these droppers that are going to give you a pretty good idea of where your water is at. As soon as you cycle your tank, you're going to need to test is going to be ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate. Now, of course, you're also going to want to test salinity, and for that, you're going to want to use a refractometer. I typically recommend avoiding hydrometers, which are going to use a little float, and they're just not going to be as accurate and, more importantly, consistent as things like refractometers, just because that float can tend to get things like bubbles on it and give you a less accurate reading. So I usually recommend going with a refractometer. You can use either the ones that you look through with your eye or the one that we use here, which is the Milwaukee refractometer, which is a little piece of equipment that you just place your sample on and it'll give you a value. Now, with all these refractometers, you're going to want to make sure you're calibrating them. We here don't use calibration solution for our refractometers, and that is because it's going to usually give you a less accurate reading over time, because what happens is as soon as you open up that calibration fluid, it's going to start to evaporate, and then that 2.5 reading isn't going to be perfectly accurate the way that something like RODI water will always read 1.000. So we always calibrate here with RO water, one, because we know our source is going to be good and have a specific gravity of 0, and two, because we know that it is going to give us a much accurate 0 rather than that calibration solution that tends to get off pretty quickly. So starting off with these API droppers, they are super easy to use. Of course, there's instructions included, but for most of them, all you need to do is look at this color chart here, and it'll tell you what the reading of your water is, but it can sometimes be a little harder to read. So you do want to make sure that you're in a good area that's well lit, because a lot of times the blue lights especially can throw off where it is in the chart. So you want to make sure that it's a well lit, preferably wider area where you don't have that blue light shifting the color of your reagents. So with these, you pretty much fill them to this 5 ml line, and then you add your dropper solution, which is conveniently listed on the bottle. Of course, with any reagent, you want to shake it up to make sure that it didn't separate while it's been sitting in this bottle. And with some of them, you have to wait a few minutes. Some of them are ready instantly. You really just need to follow the instructions. And again, these APIs are going to give you a very good gauge of where you're at. And especially for things like a fish system, I really would not recommend going any higher for a fish system than just these API test kits. It's going to be plenty accurate for keeping fish happy and healthy. And for our fish quarantine system, all we use is these API test kits as well as the HANA test kit for copper. But in terms of things that you would also test in a reef tank, it's really just this API. Now, moving on from the first 3 elements that you'll be testing, again, ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate, you're going to want to test your phosphate, calcium, and alkalinity. And these are all included in the Reef Master test kit from API. And this is going to give you, again, a very good baseline for where your readings are at, and definitely a very good idea of where things are going if you're looking just to keep softies and some very easy LPS. And for most people, this is going to be perfectly fine because you don't need super fine readings, especially before you've started things like dosing, because there aren't going to be too many fluctuations as you're just only adding a few corals or a few fish. So as long as you're doing that and taking things slow and actually allowing your tank to adjust to new additions before adding more, these will get you 90% of the way there and allow you to have a very good and healthy tank. Now, once you've cycled and everything, you really don't need to test ammonia and nitrite unless you're having issues with something, like a fish isn't doing well or a coral isn't doing well, or you have a lot of die-off. You really are done testing ammonia and nitrite. And a lot of times what I recommend is just going to your local fish store and having them test your water for you during your cycle, because they will be able to give you those readings. And after that, you really don't need these test kits anymore. So we're gonna move them off to the side. So now that we've got our tanks cycled and we're going through our testing procedures, you're going to want to test your water every week. I recommend every week because this is gonna give you a rigid consistency where it'll make sure you're getting a more consistent reading. Now, what I mean by that is you want to test your water at the same time every week and having done the same thing. So, for instance, if you change your water every Saturday, I would recommend right before that water change, you take out a water sample, test your water, and get a good reading of what your water is like. And if you have any wide ranges or issues with that water test, what you're going to want to do is after that water change, wait a day, maybe two, let that water mix in and retest that element, or a full course test again to make sure that everything is still within a good range that you are desiring. So if you do end up getting out of whack with your testing and start testing at different times, you might start running into different readings, especially with things like pH. They're gonna vary a lot throughout the day. pH at night can drop as low as 7.7 or 7.8, but during the day it can be as high as 8.3. And so if you test at different times of the day, you're gonna get wildly different readings, which is why I recommend testing at the same time. Same thing, if you feed pretty heavy or you do a coral feeding right before you test, your numbers are likely gonna be skewed. So it's best to wait a few hours, if not a day, before testing your tank, especially after you do something like coral feeding, which is usually gonna be very nutrient dense and add a lot of things like nitrates and phosphates to your tank. Same thing with dosing. If you add a bunch of alkalinity dosage to your tank and test 10 minutes later, you're probably going to get a much higher alkalinity reading than you actually have in your aquarium, because that water hasn't mixed together with that alkalinity supplement yet. So there's going to be a mismatch in your numbers. So again, definitely maintaining consistency is very important, and also making sure that your test kits are in date, so they're not expired, and also making sure that you're not towards the bottom of a bottle. I've noticed a lot of times with a lot of different brands, once you get to the bottom of the bottle, especially if you're not shaking vigorously every time right before using it, you're gonna run into some consistency issues because you won't end up with the proper amount of reagent or the proper ratios of reagent. So making sure that you have all this in mind. Whenever you get some funky reading, I always recommend double checking that reading, because there are definitely flukes that can happen even with the test kit. If you're performing it perfectly, there's always things that can happen, whether it's a drop getting stuck in the top or one accidentally missing the tube and falling off to the side. Whenever you're getting a very weird reading, especially if it doesn't line up with the rest of your testing, I recommend testing again and not freaking out and starting to do an emergency water change or adding a bunch of alkalinity supplement and messing up your water that way. So now that we've got our basic testing out of the way and your corals are starting to grow, you're gonna wanna start dosing. Now, for dosing, there are a lot of people who will just start dosing based on following the recommendations on some sort of product bottle, but those really aren't going to be very accurate. For instance, we dose Fusion 1 and 2 here on our SPS system, and based on the recommended dosage, we'd be dosing roughly 50 mils per day of Fusion 2, but we actually end up dosing 200. And same thing with Fusion 1, we'd be dosing the same amount of Fusion 1 as we dose Fusion 2, but we end up dosing about 150 mils of Fusion 1, which is definitely a lot less than the 200 mils of Fusion 2 we're dosing. And the only way that we're able to maintain proper levels of calcium and alkalinity in this instance is because we test our water frequently and adjust our dosages based on that. I would recommend once you get into this level of dosing and testing, you're testing your water every week until you start to stop adding corals, stop adding as many fish, and once you have kind of an established tank where you don't have your readings changing too much, you're not increasing your dosing every week or every other week, and you kind of have found this balance, you can start to back off your testing to, I would recommend once a month be the furthest out that you test. But you can definitely get away with a little bit longer in between tests. Again, it's all going to kind of vary based on things like the tank size and how many corals you have. If you have a smaller nano tank, definitely any more than a month might run into some issues. But if you have a large 300-400 gallon tank, you can probably wait a little bit longer to test, as long as you don't run into any other issues. So a lot of times with testing, it's not just making sure that you're dosing the right amount or that you've added more corals and now you need to dose more. But for instance, we've had some issues with a tube coming unstuck and then all of a sudden our calcium drops. And if we weren't testing every week, our calcium would have dropped even further, down to something like 100 or 200, rather than dropping down to about 360, where we're able to catch it pretty quickly and identify that there's an issue with one of our dosing tubes. We can clear that line, get it running again without running into any catastrophic errors. So that's another benefit of dosing, is that you can also catch things that you might not otherwise notice, especially if you have your dosing containers or dosing pump hidden somewhere under the tank in a more managed spot that doesn't always get looked at as frequently as maybe it should. So now that we've covered the basics of testing, we're gonna get more into a little bit of the nitty-gritty, and that's gonna involve talking about some of the more advanced testers like Hanna and Red Sea, as well as brands like Salifert. These are all gonna be much better than API, but again, API will definitely give you a very good baseline. For nitrate, I recommend the Hanna Nitrate High Range. For alkalinity, I recommend the Hanna Alkalinity Checker. We have ours in the DKH just because it's what we typically use. We also have a ppm model, but I typically don't track alkalinity in ppm. I use DKH, so I prefer this model. Then the Hanna Magnesium Tester. And then for calcium, we usually will use the Red Sea Calcium. I'm not a huge fan of the Hanna Calcium. It seems to be a little bit more inconsistent, especially with a wide range of people testing. If you have one person testing who is very good at that, it can work well. But for us, we have a lot of different people who test our water here, a lot of different employees, as well as myself. So I like the Red Sea because it's a little bit more consistent for us. And finally, for phosphate, we use the Hanna Checker Phosphate Low Range. I like these a lot because with the Hanna High Range, all you do is you add this little packet. With the alkalinity, you just add 1 ml of this solution. With the magnesium, it's just a packet and this solution here. The calcium is probably going to be the most involved. It is this liquid here, as well as this powder. And then finally, you have your titration. And so that is this bottle here. And what you do is you use this syringe to slowly add it in to the vial as you're spinning it, preferably. And once it changes color, that's when you know you've added enough reagent. You look back on the chart that they include, and as you can see, it's very battered because we've used this for a very long time on a lot of different tanks. And it will give you the reading of calcium that's in your aquarium. And for the phosphate, all you have to do is add this little packet, mix it up, and you're good to go. Now, with all of these, again, you can run into issues with accuracy. For instance, the Hanna Alkalinity, I know personally, especially if you're not mixing this every time you're using it, once you get into the bottom portion of it, you can run into some accuracy results. So if you start getting funny numbers, I definitely recommend, if you don't have another bottle of reagent, testing with another checker, even if it's something like the API test, because it'll give you a good idea how far off you might be. But I recommend using the same tests every time because it's going to give you more consistent results. So if I use this alkalinity checker and then I use the Salifert alkalinity test, I'm probably going to get different results because it's going to be performed differently, not only by me, but also the reagents are going to be different, and so you're probably going to get a slightly different result. These tests are very good. We use these every week. We test pretty much every system here once a week. Some systems, like my SPS system, I test, if not every day, every other day, to ensure that these are perfect. Now, when I'm testing that system every day, I'm not testing everything. I only test nitrate, alkalinity, and phosphate. And that's because those elements are going to swing the most for us. Magnesium and calcium don't shift as much, so I don't really need to test them as often. But with these three, I definitely can run into some issues, and you want to make sure you're testing those very frequently, especially if you're dosing things like nitrates and phosphates, to make sure not only there isn't an issue with your doser, as I said earlier, or it stops dosing for whatever reason, but also you want to make sure it didn't accidentally dose too much and all of a sudden your nutrients spike and you run into issues with your corals. Now, again, all these testers work very well, but what I think is the best test is going to be an ICP test. Now, there are definitely questions about the accuracy of these, and you can check out my video on ICP tests up here. And the main thing that I use these for is for testing for trace elements. And essentially what it allows you to do is find out the results and the levels that these elements are at in your water, things that you can't test for. So things like potassium and iron, Red Sea does have a test for, and you can get a value on those. It is a very long process, and it takes about 45 minutes to complete the 3 tests in that course. However, if you want to do it a little faster, although it does take about 2 weeks to get back, the ICP test is definitely the way to go. I know personally we had an issue with chromium at our old store, and we had things dying. We couldn't figure out what it was, and until we finally ran an ICP test, and our chromium was like off the charts. It was so high. We lost a lot of acroporas due to it, and if we would have sent one out earlier, we probably could have caught it a little bit earlier. So I recommend, especially if you're running into issues with your aquarium, sending out an ICP test. And with these, I recommend not focusing on some of the elements like calcium, magnesium, and alkalinity, because they can shift a lot in that week or 2 weeks that it takes for them to process your ICP. So I really recommend only using these for the elements you can't really test for, because you're not necessarily going to get a less accurate result, but you're going to get a result that isn't lined up with the time that you're at. Whereas things like other elements such as strontium and iron and all those other trace elements, they're going to have a much less chance of changing because you're not adding a lot of those elements regularly unless you are specifically dosing for them, in which case you probably are dosing a very small amount because you don't need a ton in your aquarium. Now, when you're testing, you are going to want to focus on what you're actually keeping. So again, as I said, with SPS, I'll test nitrate, phosphate, and alkalinity almost daily. But for soft corals, especially if you have a softy dominant tank, you really only are going to need to test nitrate and phosphate, as well as salinity, because they're not going to consume a ton of alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium. So things like that you can test as infrequently as every 6 months, because there's not going to be a ton of consumption, especially if you're staying up to date on your water changes. But again, as your amount of corals shift, you want to keep a close eye on those things. And with soft corals, this isn't to say that they don't consume any elements. You are going to want to send out an ICP test because they definitely can consume things like iodine. I know zoas in particular consume a lot of iodine. So an ICP test or the Red Sea iodine test kit is going to give you a good idea of how much iodine you might need to dose, especially if you're doing a softy dominant tank where you're not dosing any other chemicals that might contain that iodine in it already. And a lot of times the water changes are just not going to be enough to keep up with that. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video all about testing your tank. Make sure that you guys are testing your tank. This video should be assigned to test your water. If you guys did enjoy the video, make sure to leave a like down below and subscribe to make sure that you stay up to date with all of our latest content. And I will see you guys in the next video.